Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Now, as always, a very warm welcome to this race rating series, this time for the final time this year in Abu Dhabi, taking a more chilled out look at how the drivers have done from the race just gone. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend, and also do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy, and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Also, as a quick little update that some of you may be aware of, I am getting a little puppy soon, and I don't know quite how that'll affect the channel's sort of progress in videos, but I have been setting up a little sort of puppy channel and general life channel, and I will link that in the description for content starting on that soon, so feel free to go and check that out and stay up to date with all of those things. But now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Getting into the result then for one final time in 2022, and for the 15th time this season, Max Verstappen, your race winner, fairly comfortably in the end. In P2, Charles Leclerc managing to stay ahead of Sergio Perez, also collecting P2 in the Drivers' Championship for him, and then obviously Perez in P3, with Carlos Sainz in P4, the second of the Ferraris. In P5, George Russell, the only Mercedes to finish the race, was behind his teammate Hamilton, but with issues for him, retirement with just 2 laps to go leaves Russell in 5th, the only Mercedes. Then in P6, best of the rest, Lando Norris ahead of Esteban Ocon, Lance Stroll in P8, Daniel Ricciardo points in what could be his last race in P9, and then of course Sebastian Vettel in his final F1 race 299, rather annoyingly not quite getting that 300, but he does finish in P10, picking up that final point. On to the race itself then, and quite honestly, this felt very typical Abu Dhabi, even with these 2022 regs, still kind of what I would expect from this circuit and this race in particular. Going through the events though, obviously lap 1 was fairly interesting. You had a fairly decent start from Hamilton up at the top end, getting past Carlos Sainz, them having a little battle into the chicane, Hamilton sort of cutting across, and then Sainz being told, no you didn't force him off, then Hamilton basically being told to give the place back, so he does so, and then him dropping back just a little bit, Sainz getting by, Russell getting by as well, so that was a nice little battle at the start. However, from there it did kind of settle in a little bit, especially at the front. Further back, there was some stuff going on with Vettel and Ocon, the two battling for a bit, Vettel getting past and Ocon kind of getting back through. A little bit of an Ocon train with some of the cars behind. Before the pit stop started around sort of lap 15, cars began to come in for that two-stop strategy. A lot of people going from mediums to hards, or mediums to hards to mediums, against the alternate, which was the medium to hard, which some drivers went for. As the race kind of went on, we did see some overtakes here and there. There was some battles going on, towards the back of the pack. But a lot of the time it did kind of feel a bit like, two-stop drivers coming up to the back of one-stop drivers. And so a lot of the overtakes were sort of fairly easy or fairly simple, with drivers very quickly realising that you couldn't overtake into the chicane and you had to overtake out of the chicane in order to get by in that second DRS zone. Halfway through then, and Fernando Alonso, he retired, which for me was really upsetting. I wanted to see Alonso, Hamilton, Vettel donuts at the end, and so that went out the window kind of halfway through. Obviously, a lot of the time we were following the progress of Sebastian Vettel, who was driving really well to start off with, but with his one-stop strategy dropped him back to basically last, if not for Nicholas Latifi. Talking of Nicholas Latifi, and he got himself involved in an incident which was Mick Schumacher's fault. Mick Schumacher kind of diving up the inside, very last minute, a bit half-hearted, tagging the Williams, and annoyingly, I guess for us watching, no safety car for that, they both managing to keep it going. Back up at the front, there was more stuff to sort of go on, with Perez going onto the two stops, Sainz going onto the two stops, and so we had two different scenarios with drivers catching each other. You had Perez chasing after Leclerc and Sainz catching after Hamilton. However, Hamilton, with just 2 laps to go, retired with a hydraulic issue, which meant that battle never really happened. And then further up ahead, Perez couldn't quite catch up to Charles, and I feel like that's kind of very fitting for this Abu Dhabi this season. A lot of kind of, maybe something will happen, and it just never quite materialising. On to some ratings then, as always starting with the poll from YouTube, which you guys get to fill in at the end of each race. And for this one, you guys have given it a 5.7, which for me is a little bit generous. I think, on the whole, there are a lot of things which we were sort of waiting to happen and didn't quite happen, but it's still within the region I would kind of expect for this race. For me though, I've gone just a little bit lower. I think I'm going to go with a 5. It was either a 4.5 or a 5 for me. But I think, there were a good amount of strategy going on. There were some moves happening, if not a little bit sort of predictable with the DRS. But still, on the whole, for Yas Marina, it wasn't the worst race. However, it's a Yas Marina race. It wasn't amazing either. And I think when you consider a couple of bits and pieces, like Perez at the end not able to catch Leclerc and Hamilton retiring, denying us any sort of battle with Sainz, if those two things had actually come to fruition, I think the rating would be just a little higher. On to the teams then, and starting with Haas, and in P16 and 17, it's a pretty disappointing way to end the season, but when I look at those results, am I too surprised? Not really. For drivers then, I'll begin with Kevin Magnussen, who had honestly a little bit of a nothing race. Started on the hard tyres, was one of only 2 cars to do so alongside Valtteri Bottas, and so at the start very quickly found himself slipping down the order, only ahead of Valtteri also on the hard tyres and Nicholas Latifi, who is always at the back. I think for Kevin, ultimately the strategy really hasn't helped him out here. I would say generally the 2-stop was probably the quicker strategy, and the 1-stop was worse, and especially going hard to medium over medium to hard. Did have a very quick battle with other cars, such as his teammate, but they got by pretty quickly, considering they were on the 2-stop and quicker strategy. Rating-wise for Kevin, I think it's going to be a 4.5. It's a little bit low, especially considering the strategy didn't help him out. However, when you look along the grid, there were other people that did make that 1-stop work, even in that sort of more midfield group, like a Daniel Ricciardo or a Vettel to some extent. So for him to still be slightly farther down is why his rating's a bit lower as well. Next up then, Mick Schumacher in the final race of the season, and what could maybe be his final race ever if he doesn't find a seat into 2024 or the future. So for Mick, an okay start, stayed relatively where he was, but generally just found himself off the back of people the likes of Joe or Albon, who were always kind of ahead of him when they were on similar tyre stints and tyres. Didn't really gain too much in the pit stops, actually dropped back a little bit if I remember right, and from there was generally sort of slowly making progress, but only really getting past cars that were on 1 stops opposed to 2. And then later on in the race, one of those cars he was trying to get past was Nicholas Latifi, sends it up the inside very late, very sort of half-hearted, tags the rear of the Williams, both of them sort of spinning but carrying on, and honestly it's just a very clumsy incident from Mick for which he received a 5-second penalty. Also at that point it relegated him further down the order, did still manage to finish ahead of his teammate, but yeah. So rating wise for Mick, I think it'll be a 4, pace wise okay, racing and overtaking not really too much, plus you throw in that little collision, yeah, just a generally below average day. Next up then, Williams and their final race with Nicholas Latifi. I think the team will be very glad to be able to move on into a new chapter next year and be pretty glad that this year's over for them as well. For drivers, I'll start with Nicholas Latifi in what is most likely his last race in Formula 1, and just generally kind of disappointing. At the beginning was on the medium tyres, but was the only car to be behind Bottas and Magnussen, who are both on hards, so right at the back of the pack from the beginning. From there, that's basically where he stayed pretty much the entire time. And then obviously later on in the race had the collision with Mick Schumacher, before which he was about 8 or 9 seconds off of Albon, which for Latifi isn't horrific, it's not great either. But yeah, had that collision with Schumacher and from there was always just going to be at the back, and eventually retired with like a couple of laps to go. Rating wise for Latifi, I think it's going to be a 3. The pace was definitely nowhere, was behind those 2 hard runners, the only car to do so, and was generally off of the pace as per usual really. Then next up, Alex Albon in what was actually a fairly decent Abu Dhabi Grand Prix for him. Started near the back in P19, but made some progress early on, up 3 or 4 places, P16, P15. Managed to get past Joe with an undercut, he was on that 2-stop strategy going mediums to hards at that point, so got past him and sort of stayed ahead, but then after the second sets of stops wasn't really doing too great and just generally slipped back a little bit. He was actually at one point around halfway through running up in P11, that was normally before, the 1-stoppers had kind of caught up and before he'd taken his second stop, so was actually running fairly alright for where you'd expect the Williams to be. Rating wise for Albon, I think it's going to go down as a 6.5. Overall, it's a fairly decent race, he's done fairly well, he's finished P13. Obviously though, DNFs for the likes of Alonso and Hamilton have boosted him up a couple of places, but still, on the whole, what I'd say is a good but not great drive. Next up then, Alfa Romeo, who just about managed to cling on to P6 in the constructors' standings, tied on points with Aston Martin, but ahead thanks to countback through a couple of results during the season. First off then, Valtteri Bottas in Abu Dhabi, and not a great race to end out the season for him. Like Kevin Magnussen, who I've already talked about, he started on the hard tyres, which was probably the worst choice they could have made in hindsight. Went fairly long in, was taking them further than Magnussen did, and honestly he was the only person he really had to sort of compare to throughout this race. There were points as well where I was a little bit disappointed, when Seb was getting past and he did attempt to defend and just completely locked up, went deep and just sort of made a mess of it, which was a little bit disappointing. Comparing to Magnussen, I think I'd have to say Bottas was slightly more disappointing. You consider where Zhou was in the Alfa Romeo, that car had a little bit more pace. So rating wise for Valtteri, I think it's going to be a 4, not the best of races for him to end out the season. Next up then Zhou, and a fairly decent one for him to round out the year. Started down in P15 and generally held his position through the opening couple of laps. Was ahead of the likes of Albon and Schumacher, but lost out to them both through pit stop phases. However, got past Schumacher, got past Albon, and actually towards the sort of like 2/3, sort of 3/4 distance of the race was running in P10. However, stopped later on with the tyres starting to go off onto a set of soft tyres for the end, and could only make it back up to P12, which is still a pretty respectable result, considering how, poor his teammate Valtteri did look. So I think for Zhou, for a rating, it's probably going to be a 6.5. On the whole, it looks like a fairly solid drive, it's nothing amazing, sort of similar to Albon, a good but not amazing or great drive from him. Next up is Alphatauri, and to be honest, I didn't really notice them too much in this one, which isn't always the worst thing, staying out of incidents and whatnot, but yeah, a pretty quiet race for them. For drivers, I'm going to start off with Pierre Gasly, who was the only person to start on the soft tyres, everybody else on mediums and a couple on hards, and that strategy just really didn't help him. The softs went off fairly quickly early on, which meant he dropped back a bit, then had to stop, was one of the first to do so onto hard tyres, and took those hard tyres a long way, from about lap 16 or so all the way to the end. We're talking like 40-ish plus laps. So the team definitely didn't make things easy for him. However, with the strategy he had, he did fairly well. Was back up into sort of 12th, 13th-ish place at one point, and then only really dropped back into P14. So actually for Pierre, given the sort of hand he's dealt and the strategy he's sort of been given and put on, it's a fairly decent performance. So rating wise for Gasly, it's probably going to be a 6.5. Again, he sort of fits into that category of good race but nothing too special, especially considering where the strategy was. Next up then, Yuki Tsunoda, who had a decent start, stayed around sort of P11 from P12 where he qualified, and then started in 11th thanks to Ricciardo's penalty. From there, sort of generally was slipping off of the back of the likes of Alonso, Vettel, Ocon ahead. However, with some of the battling going on, was able to stay on the back of that train with someone like a Lance Stroll, and those two pitted early and managed to get past the Fernando Alonso, managed to pull off the undercut. Did a fairly good job in that middle stint as well of maintaining position, found himself actually in P10 for quite a lot of the race. The team then electing to stop him with about 16 laps to go onto a set of soft tyres, where he obviously dropped back and was making progress, sort of catching people up ahead, but then couldn't quite get onto the back of Vettel and Ricciardo, who were in 10th and 9th come the end of the race. So I think for Yuki as a whole, it's probably going to be a 7. I actually think he's driven really well, he's been consistently higher up, made the strategy kind of work, and is very close to getting a point when you consider that Alphatauri's really dropped off a little bit of the midfield. Next up then, Aston Martin. Although they're tied on points with Alfa Romeo, they haven't quite been able to take away that 5th place, falling short based on countback from a couple of results, but still a good end to the season for them. For drivers, where else to start but Sebastian Vettel in his final race, and actually early on it was looking really good. Easily able to keep on the back of Ocon, got past at one point but ran a little wide out of turn 9 and Ocon got back through. From there was comfortably behind him, and even after Ocon pitted, managed to keep Alonso behind, and then Alonso pitted as well, and with all the cars at the back of that train, the Alpines pitting, the team elected to, stay out long and go for the one stop from the mediums to the hards, which as it turned out probably wasn't the best way for them to go. As later on in the race, he was getting passed by a lot of people on 2 stops, the people who finished just ahead of him, the likes of his teammate Lance Stroll getting by, Ocon as well. Also got jumped by Daniel Ricciardo in the pit stops because McLaren brought him in earlier, and then Seb at the end just wasn't quite able to pass him for P9, which would have been an extra point for him and an extra position in the standings for the team. Rating wise for Seb, I genuinely think it's going to be an 8 for his final race. He's actually done incredibly well considering the initial poor choice of strategy, but then also the poor execution of that strategy as well from the team. So to come away with a point, he very easily could have been in P7 probably, maybe even possibly a P6 if the team had run things a bit better. So yeah, for Seb, an 8, his final race. Sad to see him go, but he's ended off on a really high note, and the second half of this season especially, showing he really still has the level and the talent to keep competing. But yeah, of course, it will be sad to see him leave. Then next up, Lance Stroll in Abu Dhabi, and for a result has something that's turned out to be actually pretty good for him, finishing up in P8. To start the race went okay, started in P14 and found himself at the back of that sort of Ocon train with sort of Ocon, Vettel, Alonso, Tsunoda and Stroll, I think. However, the team brought him in fairly early. He managed to undercut both Tsunoda and Alonso, I think, got past them both. And then from there, with the two-stop strategy, was able to make it work against the likes of Sebastian Vettel, and eventually sort of drove off and stayed out of any sort of trouble or battles later on. In the final stint as well, finished sort of like 15 seconds or so behind Ocon, but comfortably ahead of Daniel Ricciardo. He had like 7 or 8 seconds in hand there as well. So rating-wise for Stroll, I think it's probably a 7.5. I think a lot of that comes down to the strategy the team have given him, which obviously isn't on him, but you've still got to make it work, and he did. He did really well to make that two-stop strategy work, push when he needed to, had the pace when he needed to, and has come away with a good P8 finish in the end as well. Also, most positions gained out of anyone, alongside Alex Albon with 6. Now moving on to Alpine, and while not the best race for them, they have done enough to see off Mclaren and hold on to that P4 in the Constructors' Championship, which ultimately was the goal for their season. For drivers, I'm going to start off with Fernando Alonso, and a disappointing end to what's honestly been a very unreliable season for him. You know, started off okay, was sat behind Vettel and Ocon watching those two squabble, but wasn't really able to make any progress. Eventually then was pitted to try and undercut Vettel, however came out behind the likes of Stroll and Tsunoda, and also didn't really look to have much pace. You know, he dropped back a few seconds from the likes of Lance Stroll ahead, wasn't really quite going as well as he'd hoped at that point, and then obviously about halfway through the race the car gave up. I think it was a hydraulic issue. I think this is the 4th time in 7 races they were saying for him to DNF, so not a great end. However, as he did get halfway through, I will give him a rating, and I think honestly for Alonso it's probably going to be a 5, generally stuck behind Vettel, stuck behind Ocon, and when he stopped as well the pace wasn't too great and couldn't really make much progress there either. Next up then, Esteban Ocon, and a fairly decent race for him to finish off the season. Obviously early on the big point was that battle with Vettel where Vettel got through, but he did manage to just get back past when Vettel ran wide, and from there managed to hold up the cars behind, which I'd say, you know, pace wasn't quite amazing, but he did keep the cars behind, which if you're not going at your full pace or not going as quick as you'd like to, it's still important to be able to keep those cars behind, which he did. Stopped early as well, which was a decent strategy in the end, going from mediums to hards, and it meant that come the end of the race he actually came really close to catching up to Lando Norris, only finishing like a 1.5 to 2 seconds behind at the end. And also when you consider P7, it's a fairly decent result considering 5 of the top 6 finished. Rating wise for Ocon, I think it's probably either a 6.5 or a 7, but I am going to be a little bit harsh and go with a 6.5, simply just because, you know, that earlier stint he clearly was holding people up, wasn't going too fast. Also the strategy as well has helped him gain some places at the end, but 6.5 is still a good race, just not great or amazing or anything like that. Up next then, McLaren, and while they haven't managed to pick off Alpine for 4th, that was always going to be a tall order. 19 points for a midfield team is tricky, but still a decent race for them to end out the season. Driver-wise, I'm going to start with Lando Norris in Abu Dhabi, and actually for him, a very good race. You know, managed to pick off George Russell at the start, was up into 5th, and then after George Russell got back through, inevitably, he was able to hold on to that P6 and stay there pretty much very comfortably the entire time. Started on the mediums, went to the hards, and then the mediums at the end, and throughout that entire stint, always had a good few seconds and was building a gap to Ocon. Did push a little bit hard at the start on his mediums at the end, but that also got him the fastest lap. Did mean that Ocon was closing towards the end, but still managed to hold him off by a couple of seconds and pick up P6, which became then P5 when Hamilton retired near the end. So yeah, for Lando, honestly, not too much else to add, just a really solid, really good race, strategy-wise as well, always looked comfortable. So rating-wise for him, I honestly think it's going to be an 8. He was always convincingly in that best of the rest slot and never really looked in doubt either. Then next up we have Daniel Ricciardo in what could be his final race in Formula 1 alongside Seb. Maybe he comes back in a year or two's time, but honestly, who knows? For Daniel though, at first, it looked like it was going to be a really bad race for him. Started on the mediums, was dropped back to around P13 with a penalty, roughly stayed there at the start, but went quite long and was one of the few drivers who went one stop in the midfield and made it actually work fairly well. As I said, it looked bad kind of early on, but towards the end, really did make it work. Went from the medium, stopped onto the hard, and at the end managed to just about hold off Seb Vettel and pick up a couple of points. So when I look at Daniel's race, he started in 13th, gained 4 places, finished in P9, made the less optimal strategy work and done it fairly well. Obviously he was convincingly behind Lando, so that's a little bit off of like an 8 or so, but I think for rating a 7.5 for Ricciardo is probably fair enough. He's actually done really well, started further back, made the worst strategy work and come away with a couple of points. It's a good last race for him. Next up then Mercedes, and coming in obviously hopes of P2 in the constructor standings, but ultimately pace and reliability have let them down and they've had to settle for 3rd. Driver-wise, I'll start with Lewis Hamilton, and there's quite a lot to get into. So obviously at the start, had a really good start, got up a place, had that then battle with Carlos Sainz where he cut across the chicane, ended up having to give the place back. And where this has really cost him is I think he spent a couple of laps really using up the tyres early on to get up to the back of Leclerc. He was pulling away from Sainz, but then because he had to give the place back, he's used up the tyres and is behind Sainz. Did get back by, but then obviously he lost out to Sainz, and then Russell was dropping back a bit on those mediums, really not working for him. But after switching to the hard tyres, did look really good and was making steady progress into Russell, got up to the back of him, was definitely being held up and definitely had the pace over Russell in that second stint. And towards the end, I think he definitely would have held on to P5. Don't think he quite would have held on to P4 ahead of Sainz, but at least he was able to, make it close. Rating-wise for Lewis, I think it's probably going to be a 7. The pace on the hard tyres was really great, but things definitely weren't working out on those mediums. Then next up we have George Russell, who didn't get the best of starts, lost out a few places to both Norris and Ocon I think, and then managed to get past them both back up into sort of P6, did manage to get past Hamilton when he was really struggling on those medium tyres and pulled a little bit of a gap. Obviously then the unsafe release for his pit stop, not his fault, but it has hampered him a little bit later on, and on those hard tyres definitely didn't have the pace of Hamilton, it was pretty clear to see. And that meant for the final stint that they swapped him onto medium tyres where he did run much better and was closing up. I think he was around 7 or 8 seconds or so behind when Hamilton's car finally broke and retired. Rating wise for George, I think I'm going to give him a 7 as well compared to Hamilton. When you think about, on the mediums, Russell was quicker, on the hards, Hamilton was quicker, and so for me I think it kind of evens out with those two stints. Next up then, Ferrari, and I think coming into this one, with the result that they've got, they'll probably have taken it. They haven't got the race win, but they've held on to P2 in both the constructors and the driver standings. So I'm going to start with Carlos Sainz, and a slightly trickier the race than he probably would have wanted. Obviously lost out initially to Hamilton, then came back at him into the chicane on lap 1, very close to kind of forcing him off, but didn't. In the end, the steward said, there was no forcing off, which meant that Hamilton then gave the position back. He then lost it to Hamilton, but with Hamilton's tyres on those mediums slipping away, it meant he got back through, and from there slowly pulled away from George Russell behind, but had already lost the time to Leclerc. Pace-wise, compared to his teammate, wasn't too far off actually, was sort of consistently a few seconds away, and that kind of stabilised a little bit after those first sort of 6 or 7 laps with all the battling with the Mercedes. Did then go on to the 2-stop strategy, that's a call that the team made, and even without Hamilton's issues, I still think he would have caught him and gone away with P4 at the end of the race. Rating-wise for Sainz, I think it's probably going to be like a 7.5, I think on the whole it's a pretty good race, but ultimately the battling with the Mercedes is what's hurt him a little bit later on, and why he wasn't really able to keep up with that top 3. Next up then Leclerc, and he's done everything he needed to, Ferrari managing to make the right call with the strategy as well, so that he holds on to P2 in the race and also P2 in the championship. Obviously for him earlier on did drop back a little bit from the Red Bulls, didn't look quite to have the pace, just dropping back a couple of seconds giving Red Bulls that buffer. However, when they all swapped onto the hard tyres, really caught up well and was closing up to the back of Perez, which almost forced him to make that second stop because they felt like he was just going to get caught by Leclerc. And then once Perez had come in and Ferrari elected to go to that one stop, he managed those tyres incredibly well getting to the end. It was quite a long stint for him. So yeah, for Charles, I think he's done incredibly well, and I think for a rating it's probably an 8.5. On the whole, he generally looked to be roughly on par, probably slightly ahead of Sainz, but managing those tyres to the end to come away with P2 is a great result for him. And then finally, for the last time this season, it's Red Bull who come away with the win. They come away with their 15th win for Verstappen, 17th as a team, and obviously Perez hasn't quite got that P2 in the championship, but still a good way to round out the season for them. So drivers wise, I'm going to start with Sergio Perez. Obviously maintained P2 at the start, and on the medium tyres was definitely, pulling away from the Ferraris with Verstappen ahead of him, gap getting to around sort of 4 seconds or so. However, then on the hard tyres didn't quite seem to have the same pace, and it meant that the Ferraris were sort of catching him up and getting to the point where they were in undercut territory, which sort of forced his hand a little bit into that 2-stop as I've just mentioned with Leclerc. And I think in all honesty, it kind of showed that area of Perez's racing that isn't quite up to the levels of the likes of Leclerc and Verstappen, which is when you say, right, we've dropped you back, we need you to push and catch up to the car ahead and catch them, and he just couldn't quite do it, needed a few more laps. And I think, if he'd managed to do that, it would have been a much higher rating for him. Also, it's worth saying, pace to Verstappen wasn't terrible, however, was generally just dropping a little bit off, although on the hards was managing to sort of stay a little bit closer. I think rating-wise for Perez, it's probably going to be a 7. On the whole, it's a really good race. However, he hasn't managed to catch Leclerc and has ended up P3 in the race and the championship, so yeah, not quite as high as it would have liked to have been for him. And then finally, Max Verstappen, win number 15, another one for him at Abu Dhabi. And honestly, it just looked really, really comfortable. Started off well, maintained the lead, pulled a couple of seconds to Perez. Then on the hard tyres, I think was just managing the whole way. Was a couple of seconds ahead of Perez at one point, but then after they decided to go to the end, constant communication with the team, really did a good job managing them, took them to the end, and it just looked comfortable the entire way. And where you had someone like Perez who was fighting with the Ferraris, Verstappen, out in the lead, no issues whatsoever, really commanding. So I think rating-wise for Verstappen, it's going to be a 9. There's honestly not a ton too much more to say. I think it's the fact that it just looked so easy for him in this one that gives him that high rating straight away. So there you have it for the final time this year. Here are your race ratings for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. On the whole, I think they're generally a little higher than what I'd usually give, but then when I look back, I think a lot of people did have really solid races on the whole. A lot of people in that sort of like 7-ish range, the likes of the Mercedes guys, Perez as well, all in that sort of like decently good, generally good race, but nothing amazing. Those were reserved for the likes of Verstappen and Leclerc in this one, which I think is pretty fair. And then finally, the sort of end of season standings. As you can see, Max Verstappen well clear in the lead, Charles Leclerc behind him on a 7.6. Then a really close group of Russell, Hamilton and Perez. Honestly, I think to 2 decimal places, the numbers are really, really tight. But Hamilton just edging out Russell and Perez, but I think you can consider those three as basically a sort of almost tied P3. In behind them, Alonso doing really well as the best of the rest. He's had a lot of unreliability issues this year, unlucky for him in some places. Sebastian Vettel, his late resurgence in the second half of the season puts him above Lando Norris to finish. Ocon, Sainz, Albon, Gasly, Bottas, Stroll, Magnussen, Tsunoda, Zhou Guanyu, Ricciardo jumps Schumacher, and then Nicholas Latifi at the back of the pack. But anyways, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I've really enjoyed this season and I can't wait for the next one. There'll be some off-season things as well, hopefully. Obviously, as I mentioned at the start of this one, depends how much time I have with the little puppy coming along. But still, a really massive thank you to everyone that stayed, everyone that's still watching at this point. But yeah, without you guys, this really wouldn't be possible. So yeah, big thank you. And anyway, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. But until next time, take care.